Hey there fellow Devil Summoners, and welcome back to Play a Real Shin Megami Tensei game, or Parsamaga, if you're feeling nasty. A series that I started to help encourage myself clear out my Atlus backlog, while also getting my thoughts out on them so I might be able to encourage you to check them out yourself as well. Despite the name of the series, we actually play things pretty loose with what classifies as a real SMT game. Basically, as long as I can experience the joys of practicing eugenics on demonic denizens, we count it. I know all of the hype right now is leading up to Shin Megami Tensei 5, but we've got some time until then, so let me introduce this episode's game, Shin Megami Tensei Devil Summoner, Raidou Kuzunoha vs the Soulless Army. When I was deciding on what I wanted to play next for this series, it was a toss-up between this and Digital Devil Saga, and I figured that since I've played both games that Raidou has made a cameo in, I should probably play the games that he's actually the star of. That, and between these two series, I believe that DDS actually has a higher chance of getting a low-budget remaster just like Nocturne. And with that in mind, I dusted off my 100% real PS2, flicked on that HD 1080p button that's on the back and totally exists, and got right to solving the mysteries of the capital. Raidou as an entry in the greater Mega 10 universe is a bit of an oddball, and for several different reasons. Firstly, you've probably noticed that the game does not use a typical turn-based battle system, and instead has opted to be more of an action RPG. And secondly, the game doesn't take place in Mega 10's typical settings such as the apocalypse, the post-apocalypse, and the post-post-apocalypse. In fact, it's not even taking place in modern-day Japan. The game instead takes place during Taisho 20, which is a peculiar thing as our own real-life Taisho period in Japan only lasted for 14 years. You play as Raidou Kuzunoha XIV, a young lad who has recently become a full-fledged devil summoner and inherited his new title. Bear in mind that Raidou is a title and not a name, and by calling him so at the beginning will result in several weird moments. So with that in mind, I picked a fitting name for a cameo crossover character. Dante's job is... Actually, you know what, I'm not doing this the whole video. Raidou's job as the newest member of the Kuzunoha clan is that he is put in charge of protecting Japan's capital from demons and other such things, with the assistance of a sarcastic and cynical talking cat named Goto, who has acted as a guide and mentor to nearly every single Raidou who has come before the 14th. And to do this, the two of them begin working under Shohei Narumi, a lazy and fairly carefree private detective working within the city, and they use this as a front to investigate and stop any and all of the various supernatural phenomena that are taking place. This unorthodox setting is something that I actually really enjoyed, as it meant that Raidou carves out its own identity among its peers, whilst also being very faithful to the original Devil Summoner with its more detective, almost noir-like aesthetics. Something that is executed really well in both a story sense, but also as a part of the title's main gameplay loop. Obviously there's the combat, which I will get to next, but something that really surprised me when I started playing Soulless Army was how the game is almost set up like a point-and-click adventure in a lot of ways. It certainly never goes as deep with puzzles and whatnot, like most of the games in that genre, and as the game progresses, more and more of that stuff does start to get relegated to more side game content than the main story, but the element is definitely still there throughout, and it's really interesting to see how it's used in different ways. Essentially, as well as running about, talking to people, and finding evidence, Raidou can also employ the assistance of various demons that he has captured or fused to help him in the process. This can be simple things such as sending a demon into a room where Raidou is not permitted access, as demons in Soulless Army are unable to be perceived by most humans. A funny thought to consider when Raidou is a high schooler who fights these things on a regular basis in the open street, when to the average Joe he just looks like a huge fucking toonie waving a sword about.
Not the cameraman.
Dual wield!
But each demon can also be employed for unique abilities that can be used to help gather clues as well as other such goodies. Instead of demon races or arcana types, each demon in Raidou belongs to an order that is based on its general element type, and will have some sort of investigative skill that they can use from it. For example, the Pyro Order demons have the ability to use Ignite, which can be used both to set fire to physical objects, but also ignite the soul of a tired, worn-out pedestrian so that they'll be more motivated to help you, while alternatively, Frost-type demons are able to calm angry people down and also freeze bodies of water to walk on. As interesting as I find all of these mechanics, they're unfortunately not used as much as the game originally leads on, which means that the detective feel of the game really starts to diminish over time as you start just going through more and more standard dungeons. This isn't a totally bad thing though, as there were a few times where progression was blocked and I needed a specific demon ability to continue, but had none in my stock since I just fused a bunch of the demons that I would have needed. Luckily, it seems the game knows that this can probably occur, and it feels like 9 out of 10 times there should be at least one demon that you need in the immediate area, which you should be able to Pokemon style capture and continue without having to backtrack back to the fusion station. It helps a lot, but it still is only making a big problem a small problem, and it still brings the pacing to a screeching halt whenever you do have to do this. On the other side of gameplay, we have our good old press turn system back in We have a action-based battle system, which is a first for the series. Unless you're counting Jack Bros. Which we totally do. But the main thing I can say about the combat in Soulless Army is that it's definitely a first attempt. Its combat sits in this odd middle ground where I'd say that it probably felt old and janky when it came out, but at the same time it hasn't really aged at all since then. Raidou himself has very little to actually work with. He has a standard 3-hit combo, a charged spin attack, a stinger, a 3-shot barrage of boogie woogie that comes in a variety of flavors, and a block. And that's about it. It certainly isn't Devil May Cry. The most you can do is cancel out of the second swing of your combo with a stinger or charge attack, which will let you do slightly more damage and or get everyone off of you. And that's just about it. If you only controlled Raidou by himself for the whole game, it would probably be a slog, but luckily he isn't alone. In battle, you can have one of your demons from your stock summoned to fight alongside you. And even though that they're almost entirely AI controlled, what you summon, how you order them, and how you yourself fight in tandem alongside them is very important, and is a good chunk of where the depth and fun of Soulless Army's battle system is. Demons will, by default, handle themselves pretty well. They'll naturally fight enemies and focus on weaknesses once they learn them, and they do a pretty good job of blocking and protecting themselves as well. Although they can be very trigger happy on healing and buffs. Like, bro, you don't need a defense buff, we've already won. Luckily, MP costs seem to be relatively low to the point where I had a demon from the beginning of the game with me for the entirety of it, and I just used them as a heal slave in between battles, and I never really ran out of MP with them despite using the lowest level of healing magic. What really gives combat a good hook though is the various ways that both you and your demon can work together. The most obvious thing is that Raidou not having magic has very limited ways to actually exploit weaknesses, with different ammo types being the only way to do so. This is why relying on your demons is very important, as like most modern SMT games, exploiting the enemy's weaknesses is at the game's core. Doing so will put the enemy in a stunned state for a brief period of time, and all attacks during this period will all be critical hits. This is good for the obvious reason of being a free window to lay in the pain with extra damage, but critical hits are also one of the main ways to boost your demon's motivation, which, when maxed out, will allow the two of you to perform a powerful team attack. This is a very simple system as well, but when paired with everything else, it's just enough for the game to have a fairly enjoyable combat loop, despite it being more janky feeling than typical action games. And that's just when you're using the combat system in the way that you're naturally intended to use it. There's also a few little tricks that you can perform in certain situations that help it just be that a little bit more interesting. At multiple points throughout the game, I'd often summon a demon that would be immune or would absorb a certain element. and I essentially used them as a meat shield blocking projectiles while I dealt with other enemies in the area. Not exactly DMC4 guard flying in terms of hidden tricks that you can find, but nevertheless it's still another way that you can engage in the game's combat. And of course, it wouldn't be an SMT game if the demons didn't also come alongside the ability to fuse them. And just like the other Devil Summoner games, this can be done at the Goma... The Goma Den? Victor? Where are you, you sexy pirate vampire? I'm here! Hey, Victor, you, certainly got better with age, didn't you? Anyway, fusion basically works the same as it always does, but there are a few things with demons that will make you interact with it slightly differently. For starters, there's a loyalty gauge, just like Soul Hackers. However, the only thing it really does here is stop you from fusing demons that you've only just grabbed instantly. You have to at least use them a little bit first. Secondly, demons have very few skills in this game. Outside the ones used for investigation purposes, each demon can only hold up to 2 actual skills, 2 passive skills, and 1 combo attack, with the combo attack being gained after their first level up, and a passive being gained after their second. The limited moveset is probably there for a mixture of the fact that you do have to use your demons when they go solo, and you only have the face buttons to really do anything with, and with a block and normal attack that only leaves for 2 actual skills. And the other reason being that it was probably just for balancing reasons to encourage you to actively switch your demons during combat. But the thing is, it has an odd effect on your mentality when it comes to fusing. See, passive skills are very useful, but none are naturally on demons when you get them, meaning that the only way that they can be learned is by investing time into said demons, or fusing those demons into new ones. The reason why this stands out to me is because most SMT games, unless you're going for a very specific late game build, really just want you to throw everything into the demon blender as soon as possible, but Soulless Army kind of does the opposite. There's not enough EXP to level up multiple demons twice each as you go around, so you're encouraged to really focus on your favorites, especially when combo attacks can be incredibly powerful, so fusing things constantly could potentially leave you in a situation where you have no heavy hitting moves for a boss. It's a change that I don't think is particularly good or bad, as it comes with both pros and cons. It can leave you in some tricky situations where you fuse a bunch of stronger demons, but due to their limited movesets are actually weaker than what you had before. However, on the other side, I do appreciate that if you have got a favorite demon, you do have the option to actually let them rock for a while. The only other thing I really want to talk about on the raw gameplay side of things is Raidou's customizability, which there isn't a huge ton of, but there's certainly some stuff there. Soulless Army follows the usual series trend, at least from some of the older games, of giving you 1 stat increase per level up, with caps of 40 for all 4 stats. These are all pretty standard fare and function how you'd expect, with the one exception being magic, since, well, Raidou can't really use magic. But unlike a lot of the older games, the magic stat isn't this weird stat that the pro tag has and can't really do anything with. In Soulless Army, however, it is very useful as it provides defense towards magical attacks, which is the majority of what gets thrown at you, but also increases the stats of all of your demons by 1 for every 3 points that you invest in it. That is basically converting 3 level ups on Raidou to 1 level up to each of your demons, but that applies to the entire game from that point onwards. It also just increases the damage on your already powerful team attacks, meaning that you'll probably hit the 999 damage cap every time. Other than this, the only other thing is Raidou's weapons, being his sword and his gun. The gun cannot be upgraded itself, but you do find new clips that increase your ammo throughout the game, as well as find stronger versions of just the standard damage ammo. And finally, we have Sword Fusion, returning from Soul Hackers. This is the only way to upgrade Raidou's sword, but also upgrades them in some very odd ways. For starters, your sword doesn't just simply change into a new sword when you fuse a demon into it. It works a little bit differently. For starters, there's your sword's base damage, which is dependent on the name of the sword, which will change based on what previous demons you fused into it, with the strongest sword requiring you to fuse 4 of the game's bosses into the sword for it to appear. After that, your sword will then be given a modifier based on what demon was last fused into it, and each time you fuse a new one, it will overwrite whatever you've done before. This modifier does 3 things. The first being it gives you 1 elemental resistance, the second being a boost to 1 or more of your stats or HP, and the third being a bonus to the sword's base power. One thing that I want to mention here, since I wasn't able to find any info on it anywhere else, is that the boost to the sword's base attack is also affected by the demon's stats itself. There's no record of this anywhere as far as I notice, but when I was feeding my Thor a bunch of low-level demons over and over just before the final boss, I noticed that its damage was still going up in the sword fusion menu. It's something that's super minor, but since I can't find it anywhere else, I felt like I needed to bring it up. Now, I mentioned before how the sort of point-and-click adventure aspects of the game play a huge part in making the game feel like you're an actual proper detective, but this is something that the game's story also does incredibly well, especially in the early game before the plot escalates to what you'd be expecting from a JRPG. The entire game is segmented into episodes that start off fairly small in scale and in some cases seem very loosely connected to each other, but feel like a genuine trail of clues to the mystery that you're trying to solve. From a girl asking you to kill her, to finding out who she is, to investigating the connection between her uncle and a number of red demons who have been appearing all over the capital. It's fun unraveling all of these secrets and slowly delving deeper into this elaborate scheme that's going on. On top of all of this, there's also a short jingle that's based on the game's main theme that plays at the beginning of each episode, which really makes the game feel like a detective drama, which is very fitting since the series' roots did have a finger in that pie after all. Now, I don't really want to say too much more about the story, as it is a detective story and half the fun of it is the mystery behind it, and part of the reason why I'm doing this video is to try and convince you to play it yourself, and it would be a bit silly going into any further detail. However, this section has been relatively short, so I will talk a bit about the characters here. Raidou is silent, and therefore most of his character is really left to your interpretation, outside of him being relatively stoic and reserved. But the game's dialogue prompts, for the most part, try to characterize him in one of 2 ways. The first being that he's incredibly dedicated to the title of Raidou Kuzunoha, and protects the capital because it is his duty, and that's just how things are. The second being that Raidou is protecting the capital and the people for his own reasons, not as a Kuzunoha, but in my case as Dante Spada. It's a fairly subtle difference, and from what I've heard, it's something that's expanded upon a lot more in the sequel. Unfortunately, that's just about all you get for him. It's not like he's an entirely blank slate for the player to project onto, but he's definitely an Atlus protag, which means that, yeah, unfortunately he doesn't get a voice. He is very protective of that hat though. Goto, on the other hand, is a voice and a guide for the player, and that's really all he is. He doesn't actually do an awful lot to add to the plot himself, but his old and cranky quips are definitely enjoyable, and with Raidou being silent, not having Goto with you all the time would make the game feel a lot more lonely, which I guess that's what SMT V does, however, that's not really the feel Soulless Army is going for, so he's definitely essential. Narumi also kind of fits the role of a guide, just to much less of a degree, at least in terms of story. He spends most of the game just kind of drinking in his office and telling you where to go. However, the guy is oozing with charm, and I was always happy to see him on screen. He's just about everything you'd expect from a lazy boss archetype, but that doesn't mean that he's any worse of a character for it. In fact, he's probably one of my favorites. There's also 2 other fairly important characters who I haven't really mentioned yet. The first being Tei Asakura, a female reporter and a character who will often help you out with various tips and clues she's found on her investigations, but also is just a general friend of the Narumi detective agency. Like Narumi and Goto, her direct impact on the actual plot is rather minimal, but Between her and the other members of the main cast, you've got a cute little gang of mystery solvers that are very fun to have around. It's great seeing the joint efforts of this little crime-stopping squad, all helping each other out, even though they don't directly work with each other. And then there's the legendary mystic, devil summoner, and Russia's greatest love machine, Rasputin. And yes, I mean that Rasputin. Despite the fact that during this period of time Rasputin should be dead, Soulless Army decides to just ignore that and makes him your rival character as a fellow devil summoner. And he's a really good rival at that. He's a character who is able to ride the line between being a genuine threat and a kind of goofball as well. And there's actually a little bit of a back and forth between the two of you in who's actually got the upper hand and winning most of the time. There's also not many games where you can confidently say that one of the bosses is a real-life historical figure hiding in a bunch of Russian nesting dolls. It's certainly something. Outside of the main cast, there are also a lot of minor characters who have very interesting, unique character designs that help you in the various episodes. They're literally no more important than a typical story NPC most of the time, but between the fact that they all have a unique look and the fact that you can keep going back and talking to them when they're not relevant to the story really helps them feel a lot less video gamey and more like actual people living in this world. People who want to help Raidou with what he's doing, as this game at a few points has this theme of a community looking after itself and supporting each other, even throughout dire times. It's unfortunately something that gets swept under the rug as quickly as it's introduced, but it's definitely not something that gets entirely forgotten. For certain journalists out there who are unable to function without thinking about Persona 5 once a day, there isn't exactly social links in the game, but there's still that anime feelings of friendship that uplift you to victory at the end. And those highly detailed NPCs are actually a really good example of just how well Raidou Kuzunoha vs. the Soulless Army nails its presentation. You'll have noticed by now that most of the game's areas are made up of pre-rendered backgrounds, and this results in two things. One being that the Raidou games are the only SMT titles on the PS2 that actually run at 60 FPS, and this helps a lot considering it's an action game. And two, it means that they had a lot more resource budget to put into the models during cutscenes, visual novel style or otherwise. This results in some incredibly detailed character models for the PS2, which shine especially well in the facial animation department. They're still hardly Kingdom Hearts level of facial animation, but considering the budget difference between these games and the fact that most of Soulless Army's animations are stock and not custom made for each scene, they still work really well, especially when you consider the stock facial animations in the KH games are what I like to refer to as lazy faces. Regardless, I know I said this for SMT V Nocturne as well, but I really think that this is probably the most well-realized representation of Kaneko's designs in 3D. At least when it comes to the human designs, since the demon designs have made their way into games like Persona and SMT V, which is grantedly not very fair since they are much more powerful consoles. These higher poly, more expressive models, however, are what I feel Raidou has over SMT V in terms of its visual presentation though. The recreation of Kaneko's art style in 3D already had this timeless appeal, and Raidou vs. the Soulless Army really just went ahead and refined that. The only real marks on this otherwise flawless presentation is that certain textures can look a little bit muddy, something that, looking at the sequel, it's very obvious that it improves upon, as well as giving every single character model this kind of gritty, sketchy style to it, which also helps the entire game unionize its look a bit more and come off looking even better. And the other being that the pre-rendered backgrounds don't exactly upscale well in an emulator, I mean a HD PS2. Perhaps if there was some sort of HD port or remaster, or maybe even a mod that used AI upscaled or even just higher resolution source textures for the backgrounds, I think it would truly shine even as a modern day title, but unfortunately I don't think that's going to exist. One other thing is how the game presents a good majority of its content and how it's very similar to how Soul Hackers does it, which makes a lot of sense. The game gives a lot of very obvious hints in where you need to go next, and while it does have that point and click adventure feel to it, you're also just kind of told what to do. This isn't necessarily a problem within itself, but it can subconsciously get you to just mainline the entire game, when there's a lot of different hidden side quests that open and close themselves off to you at very sporadic moments. In general, it's incredibly easy to miss content. While Soulless Army doesn't hold entire dungeons and bosses behind random NPCs for brief windows like Soul Hackers does, it does hide some side quests and a lot of the game's more charming writing behind these points. And as I mentioned before with the sword fusion, this game isn't particularly well documented, so when you play for yourself, make sure you just run around and smell the daisies occasionally, because it's very easy to miss something, even when you're following a guide. Raidou Kuzunoha vs the Soulless Army is this weird little experiment done by Atlus during their PS2 golden age. One where they were cranking out titles like they were nothing, and whoo boy does it show. The gameplay is janky and not particularly refined, and a lot of the fun comes from a mixture of its mechanics that by themselves are not particularly great, but when melded together make something that's pretty enjoyable and unique. With its only contemporaries these days being its much improved sequel and Knights of Azure, another demon-controlling janky RPG which had a much improved sequel, or so I'm told, I've yet to get around to it. I've heard that online the general sentiment is that Raidou 2 is a significantly better game and you should probably just start with that one. And while that's probably true to some extent, I don't think that the first Raidou game is bad by any means. And if you're a big fan of the SMT series and the fucking train wreck that is the Amala timeline, then you'll be doing yourself a disservice skipping out on this one. Especially since there's a hell of a lot worse games you could be playing. So yeah, give Raidou and his stylish ass getup a chance. And even if you are playing it on a HD PS2, maybe get it on the PS3 store like I did. Because maybe if we're really lucky, we'll be living on the brightest timeline, where Atlus stop being a bunch of dinosaurs and give us a new Devil Summoner game, Raidou or otherwise.